Hi, and thanks for joining us. I am Connie Morris, and we are so glad you're here today for Budding Yoga's Technique for Teachers. We will be talking with Dr. James Herman about neuroscience and how it affects our body, mind, and learning. You will hear ideas for your own self-care and also that of your families and students' self-care. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Herman join us, and I'm excited to introduce him to you. Dr. Herman earned his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Psychology at Hobart College and his PhD from the University of Rochester's Department of Neurobiology and Anatomy. His postdoctoral work was performed at the Mental Health Research Institute at the University of Michigan. He began his academic career in the Department of Anatomy and Neurobiology at the University of Kentucky, where he was an associate professor and the James and Barbara Halsinger Chair of Anatomy and Neurobiology. Dr. Herman joined the University of Cincinnati faculty in 2000 and is currently the Donald C. Harrison Chair and Professor in the Department of Psychology and Behavioral Neuroscience. He was the recipient of the 2016 Distinguished Research Professor Award from the University of Cincinnati. He is Director of the Stress Neurobiology Laboratory and the University of Cincinnati's Neurobiology Research Center, and also serves as Associate Director of the University of Cincinnati's Neuroscience Institute. He is currently Editor-in-Chief of Stress, an international journal that publishes basic and clinical studies focused on biological aspects of stress. He has also served on several editorial boards, advisory boards, and national and international grant review panels. Dr. Herman's major research interests include structural, functional, and molecular biological principles underlying brain stress integration, with an emphasis on delineating mechanisms linking stress with mental illness, neurological disorders, and metabolic disease. He has made major contributions to our understanding of the role of limbic neurocircuitry in stress adaptation and stress-related pathologies, and has applied to state-of-the-art approaches to delineate molecular mechanisms underlying stress hormone signaling in the brain. We are very excited to start talking to Dr. Herman about neuroscience and stress. Thank you, Dr. Herman, so much for joining us today as we talk about behavioral neuroscience and the effects stress can have on us and our lives and our body. I would love to get started just by asking you if you can explain to us, define in a little bit more detail what behavioral neuroscience is.
Okay, great. I'll start with neuroscience. Neuroscience is really the study of the nervous system, and behavioral neuroscience is the study of how the nervous system affects how we behave. And so this particular discipline is very interested in things like understanding how the brain controls cognition, how it controls emotion, what goes wrong with the brain under conditions of disease or under conditions of, for example, in our case, stress. So we're really trying to make the connection between the types of behaviors that we are all engaged in and how the brain actually makes those happen.
Wonderful, thank you. So you mentioned stress. Stress is a big
Yes.
part of our lives, especially right now, I think, with all the change. And can you describe the we hear about healthy stress and then
Mhm.
obviously
Right.
unhealthy stress or toxic stress. Can you
Right.
explain the difference for us on that?
Yes, sure. Healthy stress is really the uh, essence of survival. A lot of what it is that we encounter in everyday life uh, constitute stress, and our body is very good generally at dealing with that. So, in fact, if you didn't have the ability to mount a stress response, you would die. So, what healthy stress really is the brain telling the body to adjust itself to optimize, for lack of a better term, performance. You can call it survival, and that's definitely true. If you're being chased by a bear, it makes sense to be able to have all of your resources mounted so you can effectively run away from the bear. It's also engaged in things like taking an exam. If your students are taking an exam, they're going to be a little bit juiced. They're going to have a little bit more energy available to them to help their cells work better. And that's really what this is all about. So the healthy stress response moves energy from a stored place to a place where it can be utilized by the cells that need it. And that can help our cognition, it can help our emotion, it can help us meet the challenges that we have to meet on a day-to-day basis. So that's all good. What happens with too much stress? If stress is overwhelming, you end up moving from where that energy reorganization is beneficial to a place where that energy reorganization is detrimental. So you're over aroused, you have too much juice, you perform poorly on the test, you were too scared of the bear to mount an effective adaptive response. So it really is kind of a continuum. If you think of it, you may have heard of the inverted U-shaped curve that you need, and this is true of almost everything in biology. We all learn this. A little bit is a good thing. If you don't have enough, it's bad. If you have too much, it's bad. And so that's exactly what stress is. It moves us from being low on the inverted U-shaped curve to the point, the top of the curve, where the match with performance is most, and stress level, stress hormone level, whatever you want to call it, is most beneficial. So that really is the difference. So you need to have these healthy stress responses. These are very good for us in times of challenge. But if you're overstressed, if your systems are overactivated, that's when we get into problems.
Okay. So you've touched on it a little bit, but the process, what stress does to our body and brain, what happens, what's the biochemistry, the mental and physical health aspects of stress, and I guess more importantly, the unhealthy stress. Once we get to a point where we're not being able to handle it, how does that affect our brain and our body?
Well, let's start with the body. Let's start with the system that I work with the most, which is the system that's responsible for stress hormone secretion. That is what we call glucocorticoids, or you might have heard it referred to as cortisol. And so what this hormone does, it's basically released from your adrenal gland, and it bathes the entire body and the entire brain in a sea of cortisol, basically saying something just happened. All you guys try to make sense of it. We're just giving you a signal, and we're telling you that you need more energy, and so we're going to help you mobilize that. And what ends up happening with glucocorticoids is that they go to your liver and they release glucose, they release sugar, which is what's going to give you additional energy to either meet the emergent challenge or the aftermath of the emergency. And so that's a really, really good thing to have. The cortisol is also going to go into the brain, and it's going to tell cells in various brain regions, you better think about what you're doing with respect to the fact that there's now a stress response going on in the body. So it's almost like a contextual signal. Not only is it mobilizing the energy, but it's also going into the brain, and it's helping the brain cells become more efficient. by modifying their biology. And it's also telling the brain that there's something going on that you really need to attend to. So that is kind of how cortisol actually works. So if you think about it, once again on that inverted U-shaped curve, where we've met the challenge, we're on the top part of the curve, that's great. But if you think about what happens when you have elevated glucocorticoids or elevated glucose, elevated blood sugar for prolonged periods of time. It's called type 2 diabetes. Cortisol contributes to that. It's not the causal factor, but it's one of the factors that's involved in perpetuating it. And we know from people that have pathologically high levels of glucocorticoids that they get type 2 diabetes. In the brain, you're moving energy, shuttling energy around in these cells, and that's costly. If you're moving energy from one place to another, it's going to make the cell work harder. And if you have a concomitant type of disease, epilepsy, for example, or cerebrovascular disease, that can actually contribute to helping the cells die. And so it's the things that these hormones do in the short run are very beneficial, but when you make these things extend their actions in time, that's when you start to get into problems.
So we learn in teaching that the stress will, or can very possibly, too much stress will affect any person's health. And it sounds like you're explaining why that happens.
Right, yes, and that's true.
So when we're looking at students that might be medically fragile or have some special needs, the stress would perhaps play more of an important part, or does that just affect all of us equally?
Well, it's possible. It depends on what the nature of the disease process is. Certainly, if it's a neurodegenerative condition, stress can make that worse. We know that from work done with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, et cetera. Those are mostly diseases of the aged, but there are some diseases in young people, for example, temporal lobe epilepsy, that may very well be made worse by consistent exposure to stress. So, there's also, when you have brains that aren't functioning, for the lack of a better term, normally, you kind of don't know how stress is going to interface that. It may very well, because the regulatory circuits aren't quite working normally, those circuits may very well be prone to overactivation or underactivation by stress. So that's more of a speculative answer. I don't think we know the real answer to that, but certainly from the perspective of ongoing neural disease, it's a potentially big problem.
Okay. So stress, if it affects the connections and thinking and learning, how exactly should we look at that as educators and parents? What do we need to be aware of on the biology and how the stress works on our bodies and our mind, as far as learning and memory and that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, there's a good stress and the bad stress, and the relation between stress and memory, learning and memory, is very interesting. In particular, with these cortisol or stress hormones, which I had talked a little bit about earlier. And what happens is when you have a severe stressful event, you remember that very well. So where you were, where, for example, I was when I learned that John Kennedy died, that puts my age, puts my age. But you think about other kind of landmark things, where you were when 9/11 occurred.
Sure.
And you remember that very well. What you don't remember well about it is the details. You remember the trauma, but it's very difficult to reconstruct accurately the details. You remember things, but they aren't necessarily accurate. So it's an interesting process. So if you're thinking about the learning process and you're thinking about teaching folks, you want them to be in that receptive zone. You don't want them to be, overly stressed in the context of trying to learn, because that isn't going to help them move on. I mean, I think this is a concern with children going back to school, because a lot of them are going to be very worried about getting sick, or their families getting sick. And that's going to be, it's going to take a bit of work to really settle that environment. I think the big thing, the thing that can fight, I think, stress the best is affording pleasurable experiences. That one of the things we know about controlling stress is that, we know this from animal studies, we know this from human studies, that engaging in rewarding types of activities can actually buffer the negative impact of stress. So, for example, enriching type of activities, fun things, games that can engage the mind, help the kids with problem solving, but also serve as a pleasurable context, not as a negative stress driver, if you will. And of course, if you look across people, everybody does this in different ways. Some people eat, that can cause problems, right? So eating is a pleasurable activity that engages the stress buffering circuitry in the brain. It's nice if you can do it in moderation, but if you don't, it's a big problem. I mean, this is the same with drinking. It's the same with drugs. All of these things are potential activities that are actually triggered by stress, because the brain wants its stress to be reduced.
Okay.
So that's where the intake starts, and the addictive process takes over after that. But the positive side, if you think about how people deal with stress, one of the big ones is exercise. If you like to exercise, it's pleasurable. It helps you combat stress. People know this, and we've known this for hundreds of years, that this can be the case. Ironically, what you're doing when you are exercising is mounting a big, fat, huge stress response in terms of your hormones, right? You're getting all these circulating hormones, but they're in a good context. Your brain is thinking positively about what you're doing. And there are other things, playing music, listening to music. For some people, worship or faith. For other people, meditation, mindfulness. All these things are things that can take you out of the stress place, stand to have, be able to help combat this.
That's all very, very helpful. We talked a little bit about nurturing and nature in our pre-interview, and how important it is for the process of adaptation. And I was wondering, the brain plasticity, are those the same things, and what ways can we promote this development? I think you've touched on it with the pleasurable experiences and some of those, but if you could just talk a little bit on how we can promote that, the ability to respond to stress. And some of us as far as genetics versus the whole environment. So,
yeah, the nature and nurture is a big question, and that's a big challenge. So we know, once again, from human research as well as from research done in experimental animals that early that there are genes that are put us at risk for development of diseases. PTSD is an example. Right? PTSD is a disease that affects about, depending on who you ask, 7 to 8% of the population that have been exposed to trauma, and meaning that most people don't get PTSD. So why do some get it? Why do some not? And there's a budding notion out there that there is our genes. Many of them, a couple of them actually, are related to cortisol signaling in the brain. But there are genes that, if you have a certain configuration of this particular gene, it could place you at risk for development of PTSD if you are exposed to trauma. And it's even more interesting than that there are genes that are predisposing for trauma, but only if you have had a trauma in childhood. So if you've gone through childhood and not been traumatized, even though you have this gene, it's not going to predispose you to get PTSD. You have to have the collision of both, right? So you have to have the negative event, and you have to have the at-risk gene. And, of course, we're very early in this in terms of the science, and I don't think anyone is going to suggest that you have your child tested to see if they have the predisposing gene. But I think the big component of this really is to understand that we need to keep stress in balance. We have to have a little bit of stress in our lives. It's okay. But we can't have too little or too much, because that puts you at risk of having these kind of nature-nurture collisions that can end up causing these very severe disorders. And this goes beyond PTSD. This is also thought to play a role in depression as well as a role in anxiety disorders. In terms of how you can intervene, once again, I think that in an environment where you are with children, I think now more than ever, it's very positive, very important to think about how you can render positive experiences for these kids and make sure that they are feeling stressed in a good way and not in a bad way.
Mm-hmm. So you did answer one of the most important questions, especially during this difficult time, on what parents and teachers can do for our children as they do enter back in some capacity, obviously, with school. So I'm going to change the focus a little bit and say, how important is it for us as adults to model and try to deal with the stress? We've heard a lot about not having the news on and that kind of thing.
Right.
Again, we're modeling that some stress, some news, being able to be knowledgeable and keep ourselves safe. But what suggestions do you have for the families that are at home trying to work, trying to make sure their children are doing school, and all of that, as far as just what are some self-care, what maybe are just the most important things we can do that might just trickle down a little bit into our children's lives?
Boy, that's a tough question. Right. So, one of the things that I have noticed about this is I'm an empty nester. I can work from home. I have an administrative job at the university and I run a laboratory, but I can do most of that from home. And as a matter of fact, it's probably better that I'm here, because people can probably get more done when I'm here than when I'm in there bothering them all. but anyways, but I have a number of young faculty in my department, and we have occasional Zoom or WebExes to see check in on people and see how they're doing. And if I look at my more senior faculty, they're at home like me. And if I look at my junior faculty, they're mostly hunkered in their office at work. And I think part of that is because they have to get out of Dodge for a little while, get out of the home for a little while just to maintain their sanity. And you have to do that. I think you have to think about what it is going to be that's important for making sure that you can combat the stress. Because if you can't, it's going to be even harder for the kids, either your own kids or the kids that you're teaching. It's just going to be very difficult. So, it's important to have stress management strategies. My wife and I have been doing some online meditation, which has proven useful. We do daily walks, socially distanced, of course, and really enjoy doing that and getting outside, and that time becomes protected. That's the kind of the time you have to do with what you need to do for yourself. And even more than before, this is very, very important.
Right. Yeah, I think combining those, what you're saying, are the pleasurable activities that you can make sure that there's time for as the family. Then I think everybody can experience that. That is wonderful. Thank you. I'm glad you're getting time to take walks. We're doing the same thing.
Yes.
And just trying to make sure we carve out some time to have a little downtime and relaxation.
And I'll say one other anecdotal thing from our situation. Being two empty, my wife and I being two empty nesters. That using these platforms, Zoom, WebEx, and so on, to get together and see your siblings who live away, or your kids, or whatever. I mean, these are good platforms. I think something we're learning from this is that we can improve our connectivity between each other, and that's a good thing.
Right, and we should call it physical distancing, because I think so many people are missing that social, but there's so many opportunities to still have this. And many of our children will be working from home. That wasn't, and to be able to make sure they keep those connections are very important. One other thing I want to touch on quickly is the healthy eating. We've talked about exercise.
Mm-hmm.
How not having too much sugar obviously makes sense, because our body does need some and controls that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But are there foods that that will help us manage, or is it just eating healthy?
Well, yeah. I can't speak too much to that because I'm really not a nutritionist.
Okay.
I only know enough about nutrition to get myself in trouble. But I think the good thing that has come out of this for a lot of us is eating home cooked meals. That if you think about restaurant meals, a lot of those are laden with things that make them taste really, really good, right? And that's generally butter, oil, salt, sugar, fats and carbohydrates. And, I think the key is, yes, those make us feel good, and they taste good, but that's going to be one of the bigger negative contributors to all of this. So.
Yeah.
If I had anything to say, if there's anything we've done since this began, is we've been eating even better than we had before, because we just go to our local farmers markets. They have social distancing capabilities, and you can, go that route. So
And I think you also have the opportunity to gather as a family too if you're at home eating.
Right.
So I'm sure
Yes.
that has the health benefits as well.
Well, that does have to help. Yes.
Yeah.
Those times together.
I can't thank you enough for answering these questions and helping us as we look at just the stress that our families and our children are experiencing and how we can go back to school and work and do what's best for our bodies and our mind, and try to work through some of the events and the stress. So
right.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Herman.
Oh, you're most welcome. I hope this was helpful.
Very, very much so. Thank you.